I want to talk today about what we make and why it matters, and sort of some ethical frameworks that we can use to make big decisions. So we all have a problem with making big decisions. Part of that problem is that our industry is relatively new. The amount of data that we collect, the granularity of the data that we collect, the amount we know about our users is sort of unprecedented. Nowhere in the history of the world has any one group of people been able to gather as much information about individuals as we can right now, you and I. What that means is that while industries like construction or architecture or law have sort of hammered out their ethical frameworks and the way they make decisions that have ramifications for all of society, we haven't. And in general, we don't really even talk about it. So this is an important date, not just because it was Corey, the previous speaker's birthday, but also because of something that happened in Tempe, Arizona just this year. So at about 9:58 p.m., a woman was walking across the street with her bicycle, probably walking it across the street because it had no lights on it, and she didn't feel comfortable being on the road. That's speculation. I'm a cyclist, so I'm going to speculate a little bit about that. As she stepped off of the curb and started to walk across the 2 lanes to get to the other side of the boulevard, a Volvo SUV traveling northbound did not see her and hit her at about 39 miles per hour. It had been traveling northbound at 43 miles per hour. About a half a second before impact, the driver noticed her, grabbed the steering wheel and started trying to steer away from her. And about 1 second after he hit her, he applied the brakes. Sorry, she applied the brakes. Not an uncommon scene on the American roads. We often have car accidents. About 33,000 people per year are killed in them. About 1/10 of those are pedestrians. So basically, we kill a lot of people on the roads, and normally it doesn't get much of a second thought. However, this one resulted in an NTSB investigation because that car was actually an Uber. And more importantly, it was one of Uber's autonomous vehicles that was being trained on the roadways in Tempe, Arizona. So the question that the NTSB needed to know is what happened here? Why did this person die? What system led to the end result of this situation, which was a pedestrian dead and a car crashed? They wrote a relatively brief summary report. I'll have links to it at the end. As a point of business, the slides will all be online. I'll post a link shortly after my presentation on Twitter. You can grab them from there. I've got links to all sorts of resources in the back. So I'm going to read this really quickly. At 1.3 seconds before impact, the self-driving system determined that an emergency braking maneuver was needed to mitigate a collision. According to Uber, emergency braking maneuvers are not enabled while the vehicle is under computer control. To reduce the potential for erratic vehicle behavior, the vehicle operator is relied on to intervene and take action. The system is not designed to alert the operator. So there's a couple of important things here to look at. The first is this, 1.3 seconds before impact. Probably not enough time to get to 0 miles an hour before impact, but you would be going dramatically slower than 39 miles per hour. So the system actually, if you read this, the system knew that it needed to do something. The computers had identified this problem successfully, realized they needed to take action to prevent a collision, and were unable to do it because of this part. They were turned off. They weren't allowed to make emergency braking maneuvers. And In fact, if you read the rest of the report, the car actually identified the pedestrian 6 seconds out, and as it got closer and closer to the pedestrian, shifted its determination of what type of pedestrian it was, from an unknown object to a cyclist to a walking pedestrian, all of which change the needed action. And then kind of last, and almost a footnote, the system itself was not designed to alert the operator. So while the system knew that there was a problem, knew that they needed to stop the car immediately, and knew that there was a potential problem as far out as 6 seconds, the system was actually unable to let its human driver know any of that information. Later on in the same report, according to Uber, the developmental self-driving system relies on attentive operator to intervene if the system fails to perform appropriately during testing. In addition, the operator is responsible for monitoring diagnostic messages that appear on the interface in the center stack of the vehicle dash and tagging events of interest for subsequent review. To paint a little better picture, this area where the diagnostic monitoring comes up is an iPad mounted portrait style in the center of the console. So not over here by the gauge cluster, it's actually over here and down from the windshield. So a couple things to notice here. It relies on an attentive operator, and then says, in addition to being attentive, the operator is also supposed to be attentive to the diagnostic messages and pick ones out that might be interesting for review. So all of this is in a report from the NTSB. This is really funny in a horribly dark way, because we live in a world where it's illegal to text message or use apps on your phone or even make phone calls with your phone in many places. And yet, Uber was assuming that you would be able to not only monitor the road and make decisions about when intervention was needed, but also monitor the diagnostic output of the system itself. So imagine tailing a log file and trying to find interesting log messages while driving down the road. The police will pull you over and put you in jail. It doesn't work. There we go. So, which brings us to one of the classic ethical problems, the trolley problem. So this is relevant particularly for cars, because cars, even in this sort of situation where there's a single person in the road, the car still is faced with the trolley problem. It has to decide whether to preserve the life of the people in the car or the life of the person in front of the car. So the trolley problem, let's see if the audio works here. Well, we'll see. It doesn't want to work. All right, we'll just watch this and I'll make up words.
The output, it looks like it's going over HDMI. Change it to go over your headphones. It needs to be, and there should be a headphone plug-in.
There's a headphone plug-in? Oh, it's down here.
Fell off, sorry.
Stand by. It's going to be worth it, guys, I promise. How many of you have watched The Good Place? All right. I found my crowd. Oh, don't Google that. Well, thank you. Good job being helpful, computer. Okay, see if it works now. Definitely not muted. So, just keep watching. It's going to be worth it. Basically, the Chidi, the moral philosopher, who's standing in the middle here, talking to a demon who looks like a human, is basically explaining the trolley problem, which is that you have a trolley on a track The track forks. One side of the track has a single person laying on the track. The other one has 5 people on it. You have to decide who you're going to kill. That's a good idea. Oh, look, that's a great idea. Let's back up here. Okay, please read along. Oh, that's scrolling the video. Okay. So, in the end, he kills a bunch of people because he can't make a choice. And he ends up doing that multiple times, to the point where eventually the question is asked of our demon friend, is he just doing it to torture him? And it turns out he is, which is probably not ethical. Don't torture people with ethics, please. So, with the trolley problem, one of the things that we're going to have to answer, not just as programmers, but as a society generally, is how many people are we going to allow self-driving cars to kill? That sounds really awful, but the reality is that self-driving cars are going to kill more people as they go through their training process. Just like human drivers kill people, self-driving cars will as well. And we as a society have to decide how we want to measure and how we want to make the decision around what we allow. Is it okay if self-driving cars kill 20,000 more people over the next 5 years in order to save 20,000 people a year over the next 15? Does that change if I say 20,000 children as opposed to 20,000 adults? Right? These are all important inputs into an ethical decision and should help guide your decision about the ethical framework that you choose. So, on a slightly more close to home note, is it okay for the software that we're writing to place unrealistic expectations on our users? Uber's software definitely placed unrealistic expectations on its user, which resulted in someone being killed, at least in part. But think about the software that you write. What are the expectations that you make of your users, and are they realistic, and are they actually humanly achievable? So, yes, that's where we want to go. Okay, here's another important date for you. This one does not involve anyone dying, but it is creepy. So February 16th, 2012, the New York Times published an article, and it was specifically about Target, but it was generally about how much information retailers in specific have about us as individuals. And in that story, there's a possibly apocryphal story about a pregnancy that goes something like this. A very angry father somewhere in the Midwest walked into a Target carrying a whole bunch of flyers that had been sent to his daughter in the mail. They were coupons for things like diapers, baby bottles, and formula, diaper bags, and he demanded to speak to the manager and then berated the manager for sending these things to his teenage daughter, saying roughly, she's still in high school, what, are you trying to encourage her to get pregnant? The manager calmed him down, got him out the door, and then, in what is possibly the most apocryphal part of this, called him back a few days later to see how things were going and to check in with him. Been to a lot of stores. I would expect 0 of them to like call and check in on me in a couple of days after I got mad at them. I would generally expect them to just sort of move on with their lives. So he calls him and he says, I'm really sorry about this and how all this stuff that we were sending you. You know, is everything all right? How are you doing? And the dad goes, well, it turns out there's some things going on in my home that I wasn't aware of, and my daughter is actually pregnant and due in a few months. Well, not a few months, due later on in the year. Whether or not that's true, the level of insight into each one of us that retailers have is phenomenal. This is from one of Target's data scientists, quoted in the New York Times article. He says, if we send someone a catalog and say congratulations on your first child and they've never told us they're pregnant, that's going to make some people uncomfortable. We are very conservative about compliance with all privacy laws, but even if you're following the law, you can do things where people get queasy. And that last part's important. I'm going to read it again. Even if you're following the law, you can do things where people get queasy. So in the rest of the article, they talk about how Target can tell with roughly 87% accuracy when you become pregnant without you buying pregnancy tests. That was the first place that my thoughts went and the first place my wife's thoughts went. But literally by looking at the types of things that you're buying in their store, they have enough data from enough people to be able to pull out with 87% accuracy whether or not you're pregnant. And can roughly estimate your due date based on that information. And this is very important for Target. When you're about to have a child, you end up spending a lot of money, and they've found that this is one of the few times that people change their buying habits. So if you can hook people at that moment, you end up having them spend a lot of money in your store instead of someone else's. But again, you can do things where people get queasy. This is from Jurassic Park, a classic film. If you've never seen it, you should go watch it right now. In fact, stop listening to me and go watch it. It has some great lessons on ethics, like this one, in which we read, yeah, but your scientists were so preoccupied with whether or not they could that they didn't stop to think if they should. Just keep that in mind as we go along. Do you think about whether or not you should do something or just whether or not you can? But Daniel, you're all saying, I write JavaScript. I don't program self-driving cars. But we use JavaScript for all this stuff, right? We track users, we sometimes leak our user information, we write ad networks and create ads for them. We throttle content, we sell goods, we identify at-risk individuals, at risk for various things. We have an enormous amount of information about the behavior of our users. If you don't believe that, just think about what all of your product managers use to track user behavior within your app. Like, that's an enormous amount of very personal data. You can tell whether somebody hovers over a link. Not whether they click on it, whether they hover on it, whether they think about clicking on it. We can look inside people's heads. And that, you don't even have to have JavaScript for that. You can do that with CSS. Another thing, preventing abuse. How do you prevent users of your application from abusing other users of your application? And what is abuse in that context? Stalking people. Anything we write that has the potential to improve human relationships has the potential for abuse and creating abusive relationships, or enabling abusers to access the people who they abuse. Right? That's pretty sobering if you think about that. If you write an app that can help you stay in touch with your mom, someone could use that same app that does the same things to stay in touch with someone who they're not allowed to be in touch with, or to harass someone. on this same line, 25th of March, 2013, MIT published a paper in Scientific Reports. The upshot of it was they studied 15 months of human mobility data, so cell phone data, what towers you connected to. They found that in their data set, you could identify an individual. As long as the location was specified every hour, you could identify an individual with 95% accuracy out of a crowd with 4 points of data, just 4, no more than 4. That should be fairly sobering. To identify a fingerprint, you need 12 points of data to make a unique match for a fingerprint. You carrying around your cell phone, someone who has access to that information, can uniquely identify you out of an anonymous data set with 4 points of data. Meaning that that data is more unique than your fingerprint. At the end of an article about this paper, it was written in the BBC, the lead investigator said, "We think this data is more available than people think. When you think about it, for instance, Wi-Fi or any application you start on your phone, we call up the same kind of mobility data. You have access to this data. This data is available through browser APIs. Which is to say this. We each have access to an enormously powerful trove of data about other humans. And those humans, they trust us at least a little bit, at least enough to use the things we write. So we owe it to them to try and use some ethics in what we do. So we're going to run through the 3 main branches of ethics really quickly, and then we'll play around with an application of them. And hopefully the thing that you take away from this is that you need to go and read about these more and spend a whole bunch of time on your own deciding what framework you're going to use to make decisions in the future. So the 3 main branches are consequentialist, duty or non-consequentialist, and virtue-based ethics, or we'll refer to them as Harry Potter, Hermione Granger, and Neville Longbottom. Hopefully it'll become clear why each of them are in those places. So consequentialist, you have 3 major branches: utilitarian, egoist, common good. Common good basically is, does this serve the common good? Egoist is, does this serve me? Does the outcome serve me? Utilitarian is, does it do more good than bad? Does it achieve a more positive outcome than the negative outcomes that are also possible? The non-consequentialist, duty-based, have I been told to do this by someone in authority? Rights, is it my right to do this? Fairness or justice, is it fair or just that this is the way I make this decision? And divine command, has God or a deity or a higher authority told me that this is what I need to do? And then the last of our 3 agent-centered approaches, virtue being the more common one. Is this a thing that makes me more virtuous as a person or less virtuous as a person? Moving towards the ideal of virtue. And then feminist, which is a more recent one that is tied to advancing equality and gender equality. Does it make that better or worse? Come on, phone. There we go. Quiz time. You guys ready for a quiz? These are all true, false. They're rhetorical. Think about them in your head. Should you kill Albus Dumbledore or let Malfoy do it? We're going to come back to that one. Oh, wait. I think I skipped the quiz. That's okay, though. So, how many of you have seen Harry Potter? How many of you have read Harry Potter? Okay, for those of you who haven't seen either one or read it, Dumbledore gets killed by Snape. Why does Snape make this decision is why we're here. So the consequentialist would say, if I, Snape, kill Albus Dumbledore, yes, he's dead, but he's old, he's lived a good life, he's finished his things he needs to get done. Him dying is a bad thing. It would be much worse if Malfoy, who is a young man, kills him than if I, an older man, kill him. It'll have more ramifications for young Malfoy's life than for my life. Thus, killing him myself brings more good into the world or less bad into the world than letting Malfoy do it. The duty view. Albus had actually told Snape that he needed to kill him. He specifically requested that Snape kill him. Thus, he had a duty to do so. Dumbledore was his boss and his longtime friend. He was an authority figure in his life, and so he should do it. Lastly, the virtue view. I'm Snape. I've made some bad choices in my life, but always in the pursuit of love. In fact, killing Dumbledore would be in the pursuit of love. I would be moving towards a self-sacrificial view of the world where I have given up everything, even my last real friend, Dumbledore, to preserve the love that I have for a woman who never loved me. Yeah, does that move him towards the virtuous ideal? I don't know. So, the interesting part, going back real quick, the interesting part is that each one of those can still arrive at the same conclusion, or they can arrive at different conclusions. Each of the frameworks provides a way of doing things, but does not guarantee a specific answer. In fact, they may all have the same answer. This is from Fred Guy in an interview in Big Think. If you take one thing away from this, I want this to be the one thing that you take. Adults are so busy and focused on so much other than ethical issues that we don't often stop to think coherently about what our moral principles really are, or what we think our moral principles, or what we think of our moral character. We just assume we're good people and let it go at that. It is not enough to assume we are good people. It is not enough to simply have a system of morals and be a good moral person. There are many decisions that you'll have to make in your life and your career that your moral system does not specifically address. You will have to have a way to weigh the consequences of that, to weigh the outcomes of that, and to make a decision. So you owe it to yourself to take some time and figure out how you're going to do that before you're put in that situation. I believe I'm almost out of time. So, be excellent to each other. This is a wonderful moral philosophy from a sort of cheesy movie. If you haven't seen, if you don't know the reference, just Google it. But remember to be excellent to each other and to your users, and to take some time to figure out how you're going to tackle the big, hairy problems that come to you. Because when your boss comes to you and says, hey, this debugger output in the self-driving car, it's driving the drivers crazy. Could you just comment it out? It's just a logger line. It's not a big deal. Or, hey, we would really like to know how often our users think about buying this car. You have a responsibility in that moment that your boss isn't going to take, where you have to decide whether you're going to comment out that line of code or write that algorithm that will expose the inner workings of your users. And that's going to be a hard choice. You probably won't realize it in the moment, but it should be a hard choice. So take some time, think about your ethics, think about how you want to live and how you want to be, and how you want to make those decisions. I'm Daniel Sellers. I'm a team lead at Instructure and a senior engineer out there. You can get a hold of me on Twitter at Daniel Sellers. I have an Ask Me Anything on GitHub at that address, and my website's designfrontier.net. Thanks for coming, y'all.